welcome to episode number 15 of the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. We're here in the FingerLakes1.com studio atop the North Park building, and it is our final episode of 2017.
15 episodes, wow.
I know, we've already clipped through 15 episodes. Imagine that. Some technical difficulties along the way, a lot of interesting stories, but clearly a lot of stuff that just I don't think we expected to talk about, that we wound up having to talk about.
Right.
And then having to talk about again.
Yes.
And then again.
And I think there'll be more of that today.
And that's kind of the trend.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be reviewing the big stories of 2017. We're going to be looking at some recent political news like we always do, some of the big headlines out of the last couple of weeks. And then we're going to look ahead to 2018 and what we think might maybe possibly happen in 2018. Obviously, this Romulus incinerator project proposal just keeps kind of morphing and growing and twisting and turning. And now there's a new controversy.
Yeah.
You're going to fill us in on that one, right, Jackie?
Well, I mean, so there's been some really excellent reporting going on about this as this weaves its way through. Who's trying to take control of the situation? Who is actually going to make the determination? What determinations there are to be made? So the most recent investigative work by Peter Mantius, who was on your podcast 2 weeks ago, last week?
Yes, last week, right before Christmas.
He's doing some great work. So he unearthed this revelation that the Romulus town code officer had sold his house located about 5,000 feet from where this proposed incinerator site without disclosing to the buyer that this proposal was at all in the works, even though he, the officer, had already issued a finding, which I think is going to, there's actually going to be a lot more discussion about the findings that he's issued and the letters that he's written and may or may not have signed, because in New York State, zoning law is pretty particular about who's allowed to make interpretations of terms. And in my view, not being an attorney in any way, he overstepped in trying to classify this as a renewable energy project. I found that humorous when they said it at the first public meeting, that this is renewable energy because the trash just keeps coming. Well, okay, that's not really the way you're supposed to classify renewable energy, right? So anyway, this zoning officer made this controversial determination that it was renewable energy and therefore did not violate their zoning code about waste products, waste management operations. But A, that determination was probably in error. B, he was probably overstepping his bounds in doing it. And now C, against the backdrop of having issued this, he was also unloading his property that was within the vicinity. So I think we should all keep a close eye on what's going to happen with this, because it's a serious thing. And I think it does leave a bad taste in people's mouth about the way that this project has been pushed through and the kind of wrangling that's gone on behind the scenes ahead of time before the public was really fully engaged in what the proposal was. So
whenever I see something like this, I think to myself, wow, this is probably how a lot of these types of processes play out behind the scenes and people just aren't aware of it.
Right.
Obviously, Peter Mantius has done a great job of capturing, and like we discussed on my podcast last week, that sort of specific niche reporting doesn't exist. That investigative reporting doesn't exist in today's news climate, just because of the way the scheduling and the speed at which reporting happens and the speed at which news, just the general circulation of news. So, I think it's great that he's moving through this process, but I start to wonder about, as these different layers start to get peeled back with this particular incinerator proposal. Last week, 2 weeks ago, at the county board meeting, most of the supervisors in Seneca County were verbally opposed to the project. And I believe Varick Town Board, Fayette Town Board, Junius Town Board, and there might have been another one actually, all passed resolutions being against the proposal.
Right.
So it seems to me, and this is crossing party line. This is across the board.
Even county lines, because Town of Geneva also passed a resolution, and now City of Geneva is attempting to pass a resolution of opposition. So
and I kind of think that this is just. I understand people are very, very concerned about it, and I understand that you as an activist, I know those folks don't want to let up. They don't want to feel as though they're taking their foot off the gas, and anything can happen if you do that. But at the same time, I'm objectively looking at this now, and I'm starting to wonder if there is a viable path forward for this proposal in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Because it just seems that wherever you look, there is open, vocal, just opposition.
Right.
There's no other way to put it. It's just straight up opposition to this project, and good or bad, no matter where you come down on that. It's ironic. I was talking to a couple friends, and they asked me about it, and I was like, the only person I've actually heard say something good about this proposal is Alan Knopf.
Yeah.
That's it.
And the interesting thing, and it was actually Rachel Wheel who made this comment that I thought was just so really summed up what's going on. You've got the guy who purchased the property, right? Mm-hmm. And his case to the Romulus planning board, zoning board, town board at each level has been, well, I bought this and now I can't do anything with it. And the insight that Rachel conveyed that I was just like, yes, that gets it, is it seems interesting that in our political climate, if somebody makes a bad decision and they are poor, right? We say, oh, well, that's your own fault. Like, why'd you do that? You should have known better. We're not helping you out. But if someone wealthy who's a real estate speculator makes a bad decision, I mean, right? When he bought it, he knew there was no infrastructure. Like he knew what he was getting. It was a speculative investment. And now that is bearing fruit, right? I mean, it is what it is. It is what he purchased. And now he's expecting the community, through both this environmental cost and the associated financial costs of whatever abatements they would be seeking, and just the long-term, externalized cost of this operation. Now it's our problem to somehow make him whole for this bad investment. And I find that, frankly, I find it offensive that is the leading argument. The leading argument is, well, we have to help this guy out because he bought this property and now he can't do anything with it. I don't see that as my responsibility, frankly. Maybe he shouldn't have done that. So
it would seem that would be the simple way. Now, what's your, obviously, there is a forum planned in January.
Yeah, on the 7th.
On the 7th. That'll get a lot of attention. There will be a lot of eyes on that forum, because it'll be the first opportunity for experts from the opposing side to weigh in on the proposal as a whole. What is your expectation of how this is going to sort of play out over the next 3 months?
Well, I'm glad they're doing a forum, because I think that having a fact-based opposition is great, because as much as, a lot of times some of these projects end up getting stalled simply from this not in my backyard kind of proposal. And that's unfortunate, because some projects that are in the public interest do need to go somewhere, right? So a not in my backyard pits the more active, tend to be more affluent people against people who are not as active or engaged, or don't have the ability to be present at meetings, who end up with this stuff by default. And that's really an environmental injustice. What I'm seeing in this case, which is so refreshing and great, is a recognition of people across the spectrum, all through the area, that this isn't just a matter of this project not being in our backyard. It's that this project objectively is a bad project. It is not a solution. It's being pitched as a solution to a waste management issue, and it's not a solution. I mean, it's really just another way of making money off a never-ending waste stream. And it's not dealing with the underlying issue that we produce too much trash, I mean, globally. And I'm hoping that one of the things that comes out of it is, it was Alan Knopf himself, the attorney for the project, who said, you know, we could have pitched this project 10 years ago under a much worse climate, but at least now our recycling rate is around 20%. And what I wanted to say is, well, look, at the solution to the problem is contained in the way you just set it up. I mean, the solution to the problem is to increase the recycling rate, to decrease packaging, to do all of these things. Only then would you talk about incineration. I mean, if you look at other countries who have the same issue, right? Trash is being generated and they have limited space to landfill it. They have exhausted these other strategies before going to incineration. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping that this forum will get people thinking about other strategies that we do need to undertake. If we don't want incinerators, which we don't, what are the other steps that need to be taken in terms of waste management to decrease the demand for incinerators and for landfills? So I don't know. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, but that's my take on the forum. That's what I'm hoping comes out of it.
Yeah, I'm curious, because all of these, my curiosity is because of the, we'll call it the sustainability of this chatter and this debate around Seneca Meadows. I'm curious to see if this is going to be sort of a prolonged, dragged out experience that isn't necessarily black and white, right, when all things are said and done.
Right.
We'll see, of course. And we'll be talking about this one in 2018, no doubt about that. Other big news, of course, Brian Kolb.
Yes.
Running for governor. It's official. We talked about it. We kind of had mixed feelings about the actual concept, but I found a really interesting story in the New York Times, and I just want to read a quick paragraph out of it. Brian Kolb is not a power broker or a kingmaker, a rabble-rouser or political bomb thrower. Perhaps his main claim to fame is his durability. Mr. Kolb has served 17 years in state assembly, about half that time as the leader of the influence-free Republican minority, acting as an articulate, if toothless, foil to the overwhelming Democratic majority. Is that the best compliment you could possibly receive under those circumstances? Because that, when I read it, that was what I thought. And obviously, we'll talk about, how this sort of plays in the state scene, because that's a big part of this, him running as a train goes by. Yeah.
I mean, I like Brian Kolb,
right,
and I have respect for him as a legislator, because I do think that, like that article was saying, I suppose he could have wielded the power he has as Assembly Minority Leader in a different way, to be more bombastic, to be out there. But I think that he actually reflects what is missing and what I think people are longing for in politics in general, which is a willingness to acknowledge that some things are actually going right, and to then only focus on trying to institute changes for the things that really are terribly wrong. Now, that characterization of him as toothless, I feel badly that that's the way he's being characterized, because I think sometimes we underestimate the actual impact of people who are moderate and people who do the work of getting stuff done without being polarizing. So in those regards, I am a fan of Brian Kolb. I don't agree with him on several policy issues,
Right.
But I do always feel that he is trying to approach them in a reasonable way and is open to listening to all sides, which some people aren't. And some people in his position wouldn't have to be, and he doesn't have to be either, but he does. Now, it's unfortunate to me that he's chosen to run for governor, because I think that's actually going to take his attention away from the good work that he could do. But maybe not. I mean, I guess that's yet to be seen how he manages this campaign.
I was going to say, does that, and this is kind of where our discussion went before, does this, not just in terms of taking his focus away, but if he is successful in earning the nomination of his party, does this thereby sort of deplete a really good representative of the Finger Lakes,
right,
and draw them into Albany, where maybe they can't quite affect? It's hard to believe that as governor, or potentially as a governor, you couldn't affect the same amount of change as you can as a legislator. But it seems as though, with as deep as the corruption and the challenges and
right,
the complication is in Albany, one person isn't going to make a difference. One person isn't going to walk in on day one and suddenly everything's
right,
changed and everything's fixed. It just doesn't, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these people, and this is one of my issues with these types of change campaigns as a whole. One person, no matter what. I know Senator Helming ran on that campaign. I'm
right,
going to change. Albany needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed. 1 year later, and Albany is in the same condition it was in
right,
before. One person does not change that. There needs to be the will to change. And I don't think there is the will to change.
Yeah.
As far as the entire body goes.
Yeah, I mean, one person, I think one person can make a difference. I think what we've seen with Senator Helming is that was a lot of lip service, because there has been an opportunity. I mean, one of the things she could have done was broken with this strange, cobbled together set of bedfellows in the Senate that seem to be really benefiting from this system of election campaign funding and other what I would consider to be corrupting influences from the downstate development community. And that could have been a leadership role she could have taken. I would love to see Brian Kolb transition into the state Senate. I think he would be a really effective state senator. I wish that had been a seat that he had gone for, because that, to me...
A lot of people were surprised that he didn't.
Yeah. I was. I mean, I think that would have been a natural fit for him, because I think his disposition and the inroads he's made in the assembly would have served him well in trying to break up that downstate control that exists in the Senate. But I don't know. If you want to be a Republican from the Finger Lakes, it seems like the state Senate is the place to go to affect change. Unfortunately, we've not seen that happen. So, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so hypothetically speaking, we'll call it a long shot at this point, because there are so many hurdles to jump and to clear to get to a point where he is elected or could be elected governor. What would that scenario look like for the Finger Lakes if he were elected governor? What kind of message would that send downstate if a rural assemblyman from Canandaigua pulls off and beats the incumbent running for his third term, who has an absolute war chest of dollars waiting to run?
Yeah. Well, I mean, frankly, regardless of party affiliation, I think an upstate governor, well, I shouldn't say that, because I don't like Carl Palladino, right? That guy should not be encouraged to run again. No. But, I mean, an actual good-hearted legislator from upstate would be excellent for the state, because I think what people are actually starting to realize is that upstate does have its own culture, climate, even, economics. But the thing is, it's not that it can't coexist with Downstate, but the two need to find a synergy that, to Governor Cuomo's credit, I think his attention on Upstate has been good at redirecting people's attention to understand that we have things to offer. We are not, the ugly stepsister or something of New York City. We have, in our own right, a lot to contribute to the state's economy and to the vibrancy of New York. So that's been good, but actually having an Upstate governor that would be a dream. That'd be great, because Downstate's well represented. They've got their
and that's
own
kind of
system, really.
Right, like that's where I sit on it, and it seems like to me, if you really dig into the criticism that a lot of people have of Governor Cuomo, it's that, if anything, this attention to the Finger Lakes and this attention to Upstate wasn't part of his original plan.
Right.
It wasn't part of his original concept, and it seems like, a lot of people, if nothing else, are frustrated with the fact that, we were kind of an afterthought, a political afterthought, because it was a necessity. He wasn't going to be able to get that second term if he didn't shore up support in Upstate New York. Right. And, I just... like the DRI.
You know who I think we have to thank for that? Zephyr Teachout. Because I think if she had not run a primary and actually done as well as she did Upstate, I don't think we would be getting that attention. And I think that, I think people kind of underestimated her candidacy, but I really do think she did Upstate a great service by throwing her name in the ring and moving that discussion toward Upstate and not taking us for granted.
Well, okay, so that's my other question then. What does Governor Cuomo have to do moving forward in the next 6, 7, 8 months to ensure that there isn't a challenger from his own party? Or is that already tamped down because of the war chest and because of all the other political things that are playing out?
I don't know. I think Mayor Minor from Syracuse could give him a run for his money in a primary.
She's actually one of my She's actually one of my people and things to watch in 2018. Yeah, because I think if she doesn't primary Cuomo, I think she will primary Keko. And I think it's.
I hope so. Yeah, so I think she could definitely give him a run. Frankly, at this point, I do think Cuomo is unbeatable in this next election cycle, because at the end of the day, people are going to ask themselves, do they feel like they're better off now than they were when he started? And I think given his investment in Upstate, a lot of people are. And that causes people to overlook a lot of maybe undesirable things, But for me, to actually be a strong supporter of Cuomo in the next election, he would have to actually do something about campaign finance reform, because that is an issue he could single-handedly have an impact on. He could make it a priority and he could get it done. And he's not. The Moreland Commission was totally mishandled. And to me, that shows more of an interest in consolidating power and influence than actually good governance, and that's never going to carry the day for me. So
now we're going to start to transition. You're going to see the pattern here, folks. We're going to start to transition from what has been in the headlines to what is in the headlines and what's going into the headlines. So we ran a story, I think it was probably like a week and a half ago now. Or no, it was right before Christmas, regarding Governor Cuomo's 12th proposal, among the ones that the several, I think they're up to like 14 or 15 now, that he has released on his tour before the State of the State. So proposal number 12 involves implementing a $65 million 4-point initiative to aggressively combat HABs in upstate New York that threaten the recreational use of lakes that are important to upstate tourism, as well as sources of drinking water. Right. So the story, at least from our perspective, and this is the direction we took it, was both Canandaigua and Seneca Lakes were absent from the study. And so I'm going through like I'm reaching out to different people. I reached out to Seneca Lake Guardian. I reached out to, obviously, Assemblyman Kolb. And no one was really sure. Like, it was just kind of like, why? Why not include... Seneca Lake provides drinking water to, I think, around 100,000 people. I'm not sure there's, you could point to another, I've heard a lot of theories. Like, one theory was, well, this is an attempt to just target the wealthy and or politically important places where drinking water, like in Rochester, Syracuse, different markets are. So you look at it that way, or you look at it as Seneca Lake and Canandaigua Lake. The first thing that popped into my head was, well, Assemblyman Kolb has challenged Governor Cuomo, and Governor Cuomo has thus turned around and removed what otherwise would have been 2 automatic additions and common sense additions to a proposal that he's putting forward.
I also have a slightly more sinister candidate explanation for that.
I thought that last one that I had was as sinister as it could possibly get.
I've got one. I also think that having designated... Now, this doesn't hold for Canandaigua Lake.
Of course.
But for not including Seneca Lake, although Seneca Lake is the deepest and the largest by volume of all the Finger Lakes, so you would think if you have any Finger Lakes proposal, you would have to include Seneca Lake.
Of course.
I think that it is indicating some tension between some of these proposals that we're seeing about Crestwood, the incinerator, the Greenwich power facility, and a reluctance for the state to actually take a stand and say, yes, Seneca Lake is threatened, the water quality is threatened, you've got to stop abusing it. You can't keep pumping hot water into it. You can't keep drawing lots of water out, recirculating that through your system, and then discharging that. And I hope that's not the case, but the first thing I thought when I read it was, well, maybe Cuomo doesn't want to weigh in on these projects because he hasn't weighed in on these projects to a large degree yet. And so for me, I saw it as a way of kind of punting those down the line a little bit longer. But I don't know. I don't know what other explanation it would be. I mean, political, I would hate to think that that would be the reason, that it's some, kind of punitive thing against Kolb, but I suppose that's a possibility. It doesn't make sense. I think I think the governor needs to make an explanation. Maybe
punting it down the line. Now, my thought process on it was after you read it's just a proposal, and going through the various legislative processes in both bodies, the Seneca Lake and Canandaigua Lake, in my opinion, would probably end up in it somewhere,
let's hope so.
Eventually before it became part of law.
Right.
But I wonder, just sort of piggybacking off of what you said, if the political gamble isn't worth to him right now, coming out against this, wait until after he's reelected one more time, and then use that as sort of a pronunciation against these environmental projects as a springboard when the gain would be on the national scene. If he is considering a run for the White House after this next election cycle. I just wish people would get in there and do the job, as opposed to always couching the work as a stepping stone to some other job. Like, just please, somebody work on our behalf consistently. I wish they would at least be a little more open about it, right? Like, if you're going to sort of like hold back, I wish there could be a way that they could be more open about the fact that they are going to, as you say, couch on, sit back on certain decisions. Yeah, but then you're asking for honesty and transparency, and if we had that, then our stories about 2017 would have been a lot different. All right, so we talked about one of the proposals. Now let's talk proposals. Okay. I'm just going to rattle off a couple of the ones that stood out to me. proposal number 1, requiring anyone convicted of a crime of domestic violence to surrender their firearms, was an interesting one. Proposal number 3, renewing the DRI contest. Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. I think that's beneficial for upstate New York. Proposal number 4, boosting spending on after-school programs, job training, and other efforts to stem some of the gang violence. Obviously, here in the Finger Lakes, we aren't talking about gang violence like Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, New York City, but I think it's something that at the state level, something has to be done. You have to start somewhere, and I think, this is an area, this is where to start with kids at a young age. Programs, it's, I think, pretty well proven that programs are about as effective as any method to prevent kids from getting involved in these sort of illegal, illicit activities. Right. And, the $20 million to upgrade the Niagara Falls disaster that was the black sludge. I thought that was kind of interesting on the state level. But, I proposal number 12, obviously, the algae blooms. I want to see more for the Finger Lakes. I want to see more effort with the Finger Lakes. I don't see a lot of new things here for the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm unclear about the DRI and how another round of that is going to go, because as we're watching it play out in Watkins Glen, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of the DRI in Geneva, and I suppose that you would say that's because I'm biased, because I'm from Geneva and I like seeing Geneva succeed. But I actually think that for the most part, with the exception of this awful sign, this welcome sign, which I think people just want to have something they can point to and they can say, we did that.
Oh, we're gonna have to talk about that after this. We're gonna have to jump into that a little more detail. Anyway, but continue on.
But I think for the most part, the DRI proposals were about a vision for the city, and Geneva had a comprehensive plan. They have goals. There certainly needs to be more money put into the poverty reduction and economic opportunity avenues that were discussed in the comprehensive plan and need to really get some legs. But I like the idea of investing in communities that have engaged the community in a real process, not just like this, what Ken Kammerer calls democracy theater, but, actually a process. In Watkins Glen, I'm not sure that's what's happening, because they didn't have a really robust community process before the DRI, and now they're trying to have one. But as soon as you announce that there's money available, the process becomes heavily loaded with the people who want to spend that money, who have a project, the developers. And then you have to ask yourself whether the community conversation is reflective of what people really want or reflective of what the developers are telling the community that they need in order to get that particular outcome. So I do worry about the DRI method as a way of investing in communities. I think it would be better to make funds available for community-driven, community-championed projects. But that's messier and harder for them to administer. But sometimes the right thing's hard to do, but you got to do it anyway.
Well, I like the focus on, because I feel like the one thing I do like about the contest, and I know the Hunger Games is always something.
Right. That's what Assemblyman Kolb called it, Upstate Hunger Games.
It's like the strategic side that communities, towns, cities, villages are required to go through. In order, that process, I think, is really important. And I think it's when you incentivize going through the process, on one hand, you're saying, well, you had to incentivize it to get these people to actually do what they should have been doing all along, which was a lot of strategic planning. But on the other hand, it has produced results. Now, whether you agree with those results or not, or whether all of the projects that are being, adopted and worked on are completely in line with what the community needs, totally different debate. But I at least would rather see that $100 million dollars be spent on something like this, where at least communities in the Finger Lakes have a shot at it,
Right.
as opposed to just dumping it into something else. You know, we've seen a lot of criminal justice, I don't even want to call them reforms. They're just attempts at reforms, and there's more of them chucked into what Cuomo wants to do next year. And I've yet to see any real data that shows that there's been improvement in making the process simpler, cleaner, more effective, any of the above. And, you know, you start to get into the Excelsior Scholarship and, you know, infrastructure spending and all of these different areas where money can just kind of like fall into a black hole and never be seen again. This at least results in something tangible, something that people in the community can touch and have input on.
Right. Well, that's the key. That's the key. And I think, likewise, I mean, you're talking about criminal justice reform. I think the only thing that has actually been proven to have lasting impact in a positive way on criminal justice reform has been community engagement. So hopefully, I guess I'm preempting what I'm going to say at the end of the show, right? If there's a message for 2018, it's stop being afraid of the public and let the public be involved in actual government, because that's the way it is supposed to be. That's what democracy is. So more democracy would be better outcomes all around. But so to the extent that the DRI does that or incentivizes that, great. But I'm also worried that he's adopting a policy where he's kind of sprinkling money now around a lot of communities where that might not be the best idea. Maybe what you need to do is to keep rewarding communities that are at that tipping point and make sure they solidly get to the next level before you turn your attention to the next group. Because the worst thing that could happen is this money gets invested to start things that then kind of fizzle out. You know, you really want the investment to result in some durable positive changes in local economies and regional economies. So I'm curious to know what the metrics are that they're using to measure success, but it's still too early to tell, I guess.
So let's jump here over to just reviewing the year and sort of looking ahead at what's coming next. Now, a couple things stood out to me, and this is we blocked these two together because a lot of these items are sort of ganged up together. Right. The tax implications of obviously federal policy changes is going to be really interesting to see. It was, I'll say, sloppily handled throughout 2017, to put it gently. Yeah. And then, you know, you kind of, I'm looking at some of these proposals, you know, that I didn't just mention, like raising minimum wage. Minimum wage will jump again. The governor's announced a concept to raise minimum wage for tipped service workers up to 11 and change, I believe. It'll scale depending on where you are in the state. And then you jump into something like he wants to also see that the shared services panel become permanent. And I really like, when it comes to these sort of typical blue versus red issues, I try to straddle in the middle. I really do. But when I see money being invested, so the state is taking their money and they're investing it in economic development, and then turning around and, you know, aggressively instituting new policies or attempting to aggressively institute new policies that will inevitably cost businesses more money, and make it more difficult for them to operate in an already challenged economy here in the state. I just wonder if you're kind of in a one step forward, two steps back situation.
Well, I think it's the classic case of looking at a problem that requires a scalpel approach, really delicate, nuanced set of policies, and instead hitting it, you know, with a hammer. Because this minimum wage issue, socially, I'm super liberal. Fiscally, I'm actually quite conservative, which I think surprises people. But the minimum wage issue, to me, I think is being totally mishandled, because there is a huge difference. Like, anybody who actually lives in the world should be able to recognize there is a difference between a company like McDonald's and a place like a small downtown business that has 3 employees. And there's a huge difference between a teenager who's working a part-time job for spending money or discretionary income versus a person who's working a minimum wage job full-time, maybe 2, to support a family. And the fact that the state has not been able to tease out those differences, I mean, there are examples from other places. Nobody ever wants to look at Europe for some reason. We don't want to be anything like any European country. But there are European countries where your wage is tied to your age or your income status, your tax filing bracket. The idea being that what is fair and equitable is not always what is equal, right? Mm-hmm. So me making $11.50 and somebody else making $11.50 isn't equal just because we're making the same amount of money. If my circumstances are vastly different, the place I'm working is vastly different than somebody else, it might make sense for that person to make more or less than what I'm making. And the inability for legislators to have that kind of conversation boggles my mind. I want people to be justly compensated for their labor. But that looks differently in different locations, in different jobs, across different socioeconomic groups, amongst ages. And people have to be willing to have that kind of conversation. But again, our legislators are too quick to say they have a solution. And sometimes, like you said, it just messes things up more.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, I look at, the shared services initiative as the prime example for me, where it was something that was pushed through at the last minute this last time around. Yeah. And you have a scenario where it wasn't executed well, and a lot of places just didn't execute it.
Right.
And they took the 1-year stay. Mm-hmm. And to just, it's like the Excelsior Scholarship, to jump on and automatically say we need to keep doing this without actually seeing any of the results.
Right.
I mean, Seneca County has instituted a shared services plan, but we don't know if it worked.
Right.
We're not even, they shared services on snow removal on county roads in a couple select towns as a basically a trial period. We don't know if that worked. It's December.
Right.
And we're already talking about making this a constant?
Yeah.
No.
And again, that's another one of those complicated issues, right, where people say, look, in other states where communities can annex their neighbors who they provide the majority of their services for, that works. That keeps taxes down. That reduces redundancy in government. It actually results in better services being provided. But that is not what's being proposed, right? So instead, it's like they're trying to go halfway without taking a look at some of the legislative holdovers that are keeping multiple layers of government, that are allowing inefficiency, that are actually rewarding inefficiency in some circumstances, and instead just telling municipalities, well, come up with a plan to fix it yourself, when you're asking the people who are vested in the system as it currently exists to fix it. And that's not a good strategy. That's like me asking my kids to resolve their internal debate about who gets a bigger piece of chocolate, right? Like, they both want it, so they need a third-party arbiter to say, this is the fair distribution of this. Yeah. Now, granted, I would tell my kids to work it out because they need to learn those skills. So that's a simple example. But I'm just saying that that's not always the best way to approach a complex problem.
And, jumping from that, it's almost like, you have these really complex problems, really expensive problems, really high-cost issues.
Right.
And it's interesting that the state sits atop the structure and says, you guys need to spend less. Meanwhile, they continue to spend more.
Right. And to institute laws and regulations that can't help but pass costs on to the municipalities. Yeah, unfunded mandates, right? It's like the calling card of things that are wrong with New York State government. Now, some of those regulations clearly are necessary and good, but if you tell them to do it without giving them the tools to do it, you can't be surprised when the outcome is higher cost of government operations. Mm-hmm. So again, state legislators, and I hate to indict all of them, but I think they're all guilty of this.
Indict them all.
They do a very terrible job of staying in contact with the elected officials and the real on-the-ground issues of local government. So what's the point? State government cannot operate in a vacuum. If the legislators don't know the challenges of their particular local governments in their jurisdiction, how are they going to make good laws? They're too disconnected from us.
What does 2018 look like then? In your opinion, good, bad, ugly, somewhere in the middle.
Well, I am an optimist, right? So I always think it can get better, and I always know it will get better. It will get better with our good industry. But really, my message is, and this is, I wrote a column about it to the paper, which is going to come out at some point, maybe this weekend, that if there's any message for 2018, it has got to be the recognition of the power of the people, right? Like, I know that's kind of I suppose an old slogan, power to the people, but really, look at the only thing that changes things is the active engagement of people who A, pay attention to what's going on, and B, show up to say something about it.
Yeah.
And let's look at Seneca Falls for a second. Because if there's ever a lesson to be had...
I don't think we've talked about them yet today. Might as well.
If we'd like to look at how not to do things, we have a very good example in Seneca Falls. And the fear of the public has manifested itself in so many bad policies. And just end of the year, there was a really great piece in the Finger Lakes Times last night that Allison Stokes wrote that really summarized it. So Geneva moved from this full-time attorney model to a part-time model, reduced costs. Moved from a full-time IT director to a part-time shared services IT director with Canandaigua, cut costs. Okay? That's a city, 13,000 people. Mm-hmm. Seneca Falls has decided whatever Geneva's discarding, they would like to pick up and add to their budget. So now they've increased the cost for their legal services, and they've added a full-time IT director. And I'm thinking, what is the really complicated computer system that Seneca Falls is running that they need something that the entire city of Geneva and the city of Canandaigua is managing to do with less manpower and less financial resources? At a time when Seneca Falls' budget seems out of control, it's like they're making all the wrong choices. So, and why is that? Because they are governing in isolation. When you put government on lockdown and you don't let the people actually give their opinions and have a free discussion and open up the books and invite people in, you end up making mistakes because you think you're smarter than everybody else. And I hate to break it to people, but the collective wisdom of the community is always better than the isolated wisdom of the people in charge.
I'll just say I agree with like 99.9% of that because I think you articulated it really well. And I think at this point, that's something that makes me really optimistic about 2018. In Seneca Falls especially. You have more people involved. You have more people speaking, engaging, digging for the facts, whether they're presented to them at a meeting or whether they have to physically dig for them themselves.
Right.
One way or another, they're getting the information and they're becoming informed. And I think we're kind of seeing a transition of just from certain individuals and like a select group of, we'll call them activists, to the entire community becoming better informed.
Yes.
And, I said it last month when we talked about the budget that Seneca Falls passed. I think there's going to be an awakening when tax bills start to come out over the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I think that there are going to be a lot. I think at December's meeting, they only had to hear from one resident taxpayer who was upset with the fact that his tax bill was going to skyrocket.
When the bills come out, they will hear from more.
Right.
Yes.
And I'm optimistic because I'm seeing. One of the things that caught my attention when I was going through what we would talk about today, I saw that Cayuga and Yates County, both of their legislators are going to have new leadership. So both chairmen, Keith Batman and Tim Dennis are stepping down for various reasons. They're making way for new leadership to come in. And I just I see this sort of transition of, when you see a refreshment of who is in control and who is, at the head of the table and who is talking at the table. Right. That's positive. That's good for government. That's good for how it functions.
Right.
And I think, it doesn't look like there's going to be any big changes in Seneca County or Wayne County or Ontario County, at least at this point. Mm-hmm. But, it still sends the right message. It sends the message that, if you want to find good things, there are good things happening.
Right.
And I think that was sort of where I was going with 2018. You can choose to lock into, and I wrote about this in my last column because it was really starting to wear on me with the way some folks, I'll call them activists, I'll call them legislators at various levels, lock into one issue, mm-hmm. and they become fixated on it. And they look at every other issue that comes up through the lens of that single problem. And it drives me crazy because you can't approach it that way. You can't approach, if you're going to come to objective answers, if you're going to come to objective conclusions about anything, mm-hmm. if you're going to fix any of the problems that we face right now, you're going to have to do it from an objective standpoint. You're going to have to stand back. You're going to have to put down your activist hat on one issue and look at this and say, okay, that's interesting. Now, I look at in Seneca Falls for a local example, Doug Avery. Great example of somebody who was, to some degree, still is an activist of the sorts, but transitioned into a neutral, objective role by running for office. And, you look at some of the people who are represented around the area. Brian Kolb obviously has managed to fill that role, and like a Lou Gard in Geneva. You have these different people who have managed to do it. And that, to me, is a very good sign for what 2018 and the future looks like in the area.
I agree. I think, a quiet government meeting is the most dangerous thing. So the more people who are speaking and listening, and talking to one another. It should always be a dialogue. I mean, I think that it shouldn't just be, we saw in Geneva, nobody wins when one group is shouting and the other group's ears are closed. It only works when people are exchanging good information and trying to get to the right answers. Yeah. And I hope that that's what continues in 2018, because I think maybe it's got to get really terrible before it can get good, right? So maybe that's my hope for Seneca Falls.
That's a grim way of looking at it, but yeah, I guess got to hit rock bottom before you can climb back up.
Well, and maybe that's where Seneca Falls is, right? People are going to open their tax bills and they're going to say, wait a second, maybe I better clue in to what's actually going on. And when they find out what's going on, I would anticipate there will be some anger, some wait, this doesn't sound right. And then those people are going to have to come forward and say, we want to be part of finding a solution to this. We want to get ourselves out of a bad situation. And I believe we can all do that. We all have the ability to be part of a better way of doing things.
Agreed. Okay, so this is it. Do you have a New Year's resolution? I want to ask you that before we...
Oh, a personal New Year's resolution?
Any sort of New Year's resolution?
I always make a list of them and then forget a week later what they are.
See what ones are going to stick?
I don't know. I feel like I'm always trying to be a better person, so I'm going to continue with that one.
All right.
Which means more dialogue, more listening to people that I don't, on the face of it, agree with, because I feel like this year talking, particularly to people like who voted for Trump, right? I feel like I learned a lot. And I think having more compassion for people with different opinions and figuring out, like I always tell my kids, everybody's got a struggle. And I think the more we tune into what other people's struggles are, the more likely we are to actually find good solutions to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
What's yours?
Just survive 2018. Continue moving forward. I usually don't participate just because, like you said, they usually don't come together all that well or stick. And, if you can start on January 1st, why not start on any of the other days out of the entire year? But hey, something new we're going to start doing, because I've been slowly collecting all of these emails and questions that people have been throwing our way, not just at this with this podcast, but with a bunch of our news and political podcasts. So what we're going to start doing in 2018 is start the show with answering some questions.
That'd be great.
And it'll be listener questions, reader questions. Some of it'll be, functional questions about how, certain things function in government and otherwise, and we'll try to give you some good answers on that front. And others might just be questions about larger, more global political issues that we don't necessarily get to talk about ordinarily in this show.
Yeah.
So send them in. Let us know on Facebook. Facebook is the easiest way to connect with us. It's Debrief Pod. If you can't spell that or find that, go ahead and check it on Google, or just look at your screen in a minute, or right now it's right there. It's staring at you. But that's going to do it for this week's show. Let us know what's on your mind. We would love to hear from you. And, of course, a big thanks to FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Remember, all of our episodes are available on FingerLakes1.tv. The show is also available on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks for making us a part of your 2017, and have a happy and safe New Year.